Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Daniel Talks. Today we're going to be talking about Christopher Nolan's new movie, Dunkirk. So let's get right into it. I am so conflicted about this movie because on one hand, it is such an intense and visceral experience. Christopher Nolan said he wanted to do this from the onset and he achieved it 100% perfectly. But is it a good film? Is it a good story? Was this movie good or not? Some critics are calling it the greatest war film of all time. Do I agree with that? I don't know. That's one of the biggest internal conflicts I've had since I left the screening last night. Because on one hand, Christopher Nolan achieved 100% what he was striving for. He crafted a war movie that was visceral, intense. You were with the soldiers at all times. There was never any moments where you didn't feel within the conflict. On this level, he did succeed. He perfected it. It is great in that sense. There's no fucking denying it. However, is it a great film? Where's the drama? Where is the character development? These are essential to films in general, but particularly blockbuster filmmaking. I've never seen a film on this large of a scale about a war not have a through line of some sorts. I mean, even The Thin Red Line, a Terrence Malick film, had a through line, had a story, some character development. And in this film, there's really none of that. That's one of its greatest strengths, but also one of its greatest weaknesses. Because on one hand, there is a documentary type feel to this entire film, with the exception of the scenes in the boat. Those were dramatized for sure. There had to have been some sort of like human connection, and that's how Christopher Nolan utilized it. So in that regards, yes, there's some drama. But I mean, overall, a movie of this size to not basically have any definitely helps its case in that documentary feel, because you don't really know about backstory and things that are going on basically outside of the conflict, because none of it matters. The movie's ultimately about survival, and he nailed that. 100% nailed that. There were moments where I was flinching at the gunfire, particularly that scene in the boat towards the end. It was I was at the edge of my seat because you didn't see the enemy. That's something Christopher Nolan does in this movie, is he hides the enemy. He never, I don't believe I heard the word Nazi throughout the entire film. I think I only saw German soldiers at the very, very end of the movie when Tom Hardy's character gets captured, which is very interesting. Again, a movie about war, you don't see the enemy. Of course you see the planes, but I'm talking about physical human beings. An airplane's one thing, but seeing actual soldiers, seeing the faces of the enemy. I mean, you see this in Saving Private Ryan. You see it in Hacksaw Ridge and a lot of other war movies. I mean, every war movie, literally every war movie. And this film goes at great lengths to not do that. And that's kind of a technically impressive feat. I mean, technically this movie is one of the greatest made, period. Yes, it is one of the greatest war films ever made, period. In terms of production, on a technical level, okay? I mean, Christopher Nolan's actually flying airplanes up there. Tom Hardy's in these airplanes. They retrofitted some of these planes so you can have two people, so Tom Hardy can actually act in the cockpit in the fucking sky. I mean, that is some technically impressive shit, okay? It just is. Having that many extras on a modern production film of this size without the use of CGI is impressive, okay? It's up there with Saving Private Ryan on a technical level. On a story level, though, again, I'm going to probably bounce back and forth about this, but it's really the only thing that bothers me, with the exception of one thing, which I will get into a little bit later, is the fact that there's no story. It's because of this fact that if someone asks me, hey, Daniel, did you see Dunkirk? Do you recommend it? My answer is going to be this. I enjoyed the movie. It's an intense experience, but if you're expecting a story, you're not going to get one. And that's basically what I would tell them, because that's the truth. And some people genuinely care about human stories. They go to the movies to escape, not to experience the realities of war. So because of this fact, it becomes a harder film to recommend to people of all ages above the age of 13. Again, I'm not saying it's bad. I really think it's great. I genuinely think it is a fucking tremendously made film. From start to finish, there's 100% effort. There's no lazy bullshit at all. And on that level, it deserves all the praise, 100%. But people who want a story, people want a Saving Private Ryan moment where you can care for these characters, you can laugh with these characters, you know, you can grow with them. This isn't a movie for you. And I don't know if that's a good or a bad thing. So let's get one thing straight. I'm glad the movie exists. I know it sounds like I'm hating on it, but I am 100% glad that it exists. I wouldn't want all war movies to be made this way, however, but I'm glad that this one does. That's what makes it more special. That's what makes it more unique. Never, ever, ever has there been a movie where I felt like I was in the war zone. I felt like I don't want to go there, and this is terrible. You know, Black Hawk Down, you see people getting mutilated and blown up, and Saving Private Ryan, the same thing. Hacksaw Ridge, you know, arms, I mean, truly vicious stuff. And I've had the feeling of, no, I don't want to do this. I don't want to do this. But I've never truly felt in the action. And it wasn't through the use of 3D. It was not a virtual reality experience. It was just the sheer scale of IMAX and the fucking sound design. Holy shit, the sound design in this movie is one of the best of all time. If it doesn't win an Oscar for sound design, it's all a fraud, genuinely, because what this film does is unbelievable. Again, from the opening moments of the film, you feel like you don't want to be in the war zone. You hear those German machine gunners blasting away at the soldiers, and you know, you could fucking see you could hear the bullets on the wall, and the way the IMAX is just overwhelming your senses, and it's loud, and they really, 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 really up the levels. I mean, to the point where I was genuinely thinking to myself, I wish they would turn this down a little bit. Like, I felt old. And then I immediately reminded myself, you can't turn down the sounds of war. This is how loud it's gonna be. No matter what you want, it doesn't fucking matter, because the enemy wants to kill you. And so when those planes are dive bombing, Jesus fucking Christ. I mean, just the sounds of the engine just gets to you. It really just gets to your soul. And you feel for these people. Sometimes they die and sometimes they don't. That's what was even more fucking freaky about the movie. The Germans are fucking dive bombing them with actual bombs, and they're missing. And the soldiers are on a bridge and they can't fucking move because they need to stay in line so they can get off the fucking... They can get back to England, okay? That's the whole point of Dunkirk, is the Germans have pushed the British and I believe the French to basically the beach and nowhere to go. And the British Navy was off trying to prepare for the Battle of Britain, what would be known as the Battle of Britain. And it's insane. They just were stuck there on a beach because they had nowhere to fucking go. They couldn't go anywhere else but to be stranded on a beach. That's intense. And so you feel that. You feel helpless. You feel hopeless with them. And that's because of the IMAX. It's because of the sound design. I can't really think of another war movie. Maybe Lone Survivor. Hacksaw Ridge had good sound design in terms of war films, but Lone Survivor was very good. Because that, you know what, I take that back. Dunkirk would be the second movie to make me feel like I was in the combat, excuse me. Lone Survivor, the Mark Wahlberg film, the Peter Berg film, that was a movie that definitely made me feel there. feel like I was in the zone, I mean, and it was an unforgettable experience. It really, really drew me in, just like this film. However, like always, not everything's perfect in the world of Daniel, and there were some problems that I felt structurally in the moment, and then overall those problems faded a little bit by how everything kind of tied in at the end. But I do want to get into some of the things. So this movie was a nonlinear narrative. That's another thing too. So not only were you not really following a character through a story from point A to point B, I mean, technically you are, but traditionally, I should say, you're also following 3 different events that actually happen at different times during the Battle of Dunkirk. And it's an overall interesting experience, but the problem is once you start to get involved with the story, they cut away, and I personally feel like they do it a little bit too soon each and every time, only because they only have a small little story for them, so they have to parse it out as much as they can. Because this movie's short. It's a 95-minute movie. Christopher Nolan's shortest since his first one, which is technically impressive too, because I was going to expect excess from Christopher Nolan. Not that he's been necessarily an excessive director where he over-directs or overcompensates for things, but he definitely does not shy away from getting epic if he needs to. I expected longer scenes on the beaches, actually, you know, where you might have a 10-minute, 15-minute sequence where things are happening, and what you get are these little vignettes, which cut between, you know, on the beach you have a vignette, and then it cuts to the boat, a vignette, and then the air, a little vignette. And then, you know, it just bounces back and forth between these. And that's how the movie is for the first hour. And I remember sitting there in the movie theater and thinking to myself, wow, this is the first time I've seen a French New Wave film that was made for over $100 million by a fucking huge studio. Because it honestly felt like visual masturbation. It just felt like Christopher Nolan was trying to show off all of the different war things he could do. Again, each of those little moments were overwhelming, they were intense, but because there was not necessarily a connective tissue in regards to a traditional story or character development, it kind of didn't add, it wasn't adding up to anything. It was just, here's a chaotic event, okay, let's rest on the sea for a little bit. Here's a chaotic event in the sky. Here's a chaotic event on the beach. Sky, calm on the boat. Sky, beach, sky, sky, sky. You know, basically that's what the formula was, and it wasn't anything but war moments. Moments of survival. Again, the movie's theme is survival. And that's what the first hour of the film was. But as you start to stay longer with these characters, they don't necessarily develop in the traditional sense, but since you've been with them for so long, the stakes of their survival are heightened. That's basically what it is. It's not necessarily because you're more engaged with them as a character. You've just been watching them for the last 40 minutes and you don't want them to die, because you've been overwhelmed for the last hour by all these fucking chaotic events. Now, I'm pretty sure that's what Christopher Nolan tried to do, and as I said in the beginning, he succeeded. However, it's that argument of, does that make the movie better as a whole? And that's my whole debate, because that first hour definitely just felt like Christopher Nolan flexing his muscles. You know, he receives a lot of criticism for his exposition dialogue, and the first hour, I'd say there was very little dialogue at all. Again, that's why I'm saying I feel like he was showing people that he can do this. He just likes to make the movies the way he likes to make them. And then once the stories started to connect and interweave with one another through editing, which was brilliant, I actually really enjoyed that back half in terms of the editing. It was definitely Inception-esque in terms of that layering of multiple stories interacting with one another. Christopher Nolan does that. I really enjoy that. I really, really do. Just because I am a fan of editing in general, pushing that medium forward is synonymous with filmmaking. And so the better the editing techniques, the better the films can be made potentially. It's a tool. And I really like when it's utilized properly and differently. And this movie did that. I mean, you get to see the fighter planes interact with the boats at different moments. You know, there's a when the Scottish pilot goes down in the water, there's a moment where like it looks like he's waving from Tom Hardy's perspective, but then about 20 minutes later, we're in the cockpit with him as he goes down, and he's actually trapped in the airplane, and he's trying to bust his way out, and he only opened the little window thing a little bit just to stick his hand out because he was trying to, you know, break out, and he was stuck. And so it changes, you know, that was a cool moment. It changes the perspective. That's editing. That's a great story moment. But the problem is that happens later on in the movie. As a result of all of this carnage and action that's been going on, it wasn't like these moments were interweaved with headquarters that, you know, oh, we got to send these fighter pilots in, and, you know, we have a squadron coming, and there's the Luftwaffe and like blah, 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 etc. You know, there's no enemy. Like I said, there's no villain. So there's no stakes in that regard. It's pure survival. And that's why this documentary thing I mentioned earlier, the feeling you get when you watch it is true. And it is true. And for that, it's 100% commendable. And maybe through the process of doing this video, because this is unscripted, this is me just going off the kilt here, you know, just me hearing myself talk right now, I'm just thinking this movie's becoming greater as I'm talking about it, is what I'm trying to say. And it still doesn't have a story, it doesn't, but as I continue to just talk about this film, I mean, the brilliance is just emerging. The cream is rising to the top, because no matter the flaws I had, like the score, I mentioned it earlier, I didn't necessarily enjoy the score at all times, because in that first hour there were a lot of moments of misdirected tension because of the score. It was so overwhelming and intense, but there wasn't necessarily a threat. It was just because I want to play loud music to keep the energy alive. So on one hand, that manipulation worked, but Spielberg always says you can't, you know, drive someone from point A to point B with straight action. You need to have some levity. You need to have some humor, some human moments where you can bond with these characters, where you can calm down, you can take a breath. I mean, look at Saving Private Ryan. It opens with a 30-minute sequence, but you don't have battle again for a little while. I mean, that's a very huge, large 30-minute sequence, and you can't follow that up with another battle because you'll lose the audience. I mean, you just can't. It's just too intense. That's why movies like We Were Soldiers is just extremely overwhelming. Black Hawk Down, because these movies are nonstop once they start, because that's the whole premise of these films. But this movie does that as well, but in a different way. It just, again, in a different way. It does it in a way where you aren't connecting with anybody, you don't get any backstory, but it, again, pushes you into the narrative. So the music helps those moments, but at the same time, when there's not a lot of stuff going on, when there's not a dive bombing going on, when there's not explosions going on, when something, you know, but you have the constant ticking of the clock because you're anticipating something. You know, it doesn't necessarily always mesh, and sometimes Christopher Nolan has a tendency to really boost the levels of his score. He was guilty of that in The Dark Knight Rises. He was guilty of that in Interstellar for sure. And so there are definitely moments where I feel like that's happening again. Actually, for the first time for me personally, I didn't think Interstellar was overdubbed too badly, mixed poorly. I thought that the moments where the score was overwhelming the dialogue, it was okay, it made sense. Dark Knight Rises, the mix for Bane just sucked. Okay, so let's get into some more technical aspects. Let's talk about that IMAX. Let's talk about how 75% of the film was shot in IMAX 65mm film. That's really impressive. And for those of you who don't know the significance of the 65mm IMAX, obviously you have the increased resolution, but it goes beyond that. And here's the side of the story where a lot of people don't necessarily talk about in the little IMAX vignettes and things like that. Shooting on IMAX is extremely difficult because the cameras are so large and so fucking loud. Just imagine where you're trying to have a silent conversation and you have the largest fan blowing by the microphone. It's not going to be usable. The audio's just not going to be good. And so what happens is, when the film's all done and shot and edited together using this temporary audio that sounds like shit. So what they'll do is they'll bring the actors back in, and this process is called ADR, and they will literally re-record their lines that they did on set. Now it sounds easy because you're watching the movie back and you're just trying to mimic yourself, but think about this. Think about a scene that's super intense where you're crying and maybe it has to do with the death of your on-screen brother or something like that. And the way you channeled it as an actor was you thought about some serious, dark, deep shit. And you're in a booth now. You know, you were able to do it in the moment, but now you have to do it all over again because the intensity has to match. It's really tough, it's really hard, and it's really expensive. I mean, just imagine if you have to bring Johnny Depp in to come in, you know, when he's shooting other movies and he has to come back in to re-record. I mean, it's expensive. So that's why it's usually done on action scenes in a lot of movies, because most of those sounds are all done in post-production. It's not a lot of on-set recording, and so it doesn't matter that it sounds shitty during the recording because they're going to fix it in post. But Christopher Nolan has tried more and more to shoot more and more of his films, even with dialogue scenes with the camera. That means that, you know, during The Dark Knight Rises, Christian Bale had to come in and re-record his lines as Batman. And so it's an expensive undertaking. You can't do the whole movie that way. But as he figures out how to use the medium, you know, maybe you don't necessarily see their mouth moving. It's very easy for a non-trained actor to come in and do those lines. That's why Christopher Nolan is one of the only filmmakers doing it, because he's figured it out. He's done it enough because he enjoys that format. He wants to shoot on the best image he can, and he does, and it's 100% commendable. And the rest of the 25% of the film was shot on 65mm film. Unlike the IMAX 65mm film that I just mentioned, you can get clean audio on set. That is why if you watch this film in IMAX, the screen will get smaller because it does switch to that 65mm format. And what it does is it's usually used primarily on intensively heavy dialogue scenes. So if you notice, all the scenes in the boat for the most part are shot that way because there's a lot of dialogue, and they were probably on the open waters. They probably did not want to do this again. And so that's probably why they did it that way. You know, the inside the boat towards the end with that's on the tide, that's waiting on the tide to come in, that was all 65mm if you look on the inside. And because it was shot in a dark room, the top is black anyway, so it fades off. So you don't really notice that it's not in IMAX 70mm. Again, a technique that Christopher Nolan has perfected through the use of using the technology. So that scene in there with Harry Styles and stuff, that was probably all done at 65mm just so they can get that clean dialogue. But 75% is a long way, because I remember on The Dark Knight, I think it was just on like 2 or 3 scenes, and now you have majority of the movie, which is just unbelievable. It's really unbelievable. Please see this in IMAX, support the format. Really, more movies should be made this way. They showed the trailer of the new Justice League movie before Dunkirk, and they used the digital IMAX camera, the one that Michael Bay used on the Transformers movie, the one that I talked about previously, and wow, it almost fills that screen. It's not IMAX quality. It's good though. It's good. Please support the format. Please, 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 because we need this to stay alive. There are no digital cameras that shoot better than IMAX film, and that's a fact. So let's keep this shit alive. Let's go support it, because I know people who like Christopher Nolan are going to go watch this. But let's talk about Harry Styles for a second. I was really surprised. He was fucking good. I mean, through and through, the acting was on point. Tom Hardy nailed another subtle performance where he didn't have to do very much other than use his good gravelly voice. This time with an English accent, which is always welcome. And but Harry Styles did a good job. And I just need to comment on it because I feel like there's a lot of people out there who kind of trashed Christopher for casting him, maybe for financial purposes, and definitely not. That's not the case. He's fucking good. There was a report that Christopher Nolan didn't even know who he was until after the auditioning process. Kind of don't believe that, but I can see how he didn't know right away. But he did a good job. Like, I would go watch a movie with him acting in it, 100%. No bullshit. Harry, I remember when I met you when you first came here to America, a year before you recorded your actual album, and I met you, and you thought I was a paparazzi, and you came up and introduced yourself to me, and it's kind of an interesting experience. You were kind of like this smaller little kid, and you've grown up into an adult, and so I commend you for it, 100%. Like, keep going, keep acting. Fucking, you can do a movie when you can fucking sing too, because you can obviously sing. So like, hats off to you, Harry Styles. Keep it up, man. For reals. Like, I enjoyed it. It was cool. Like, no hate. It was no fucking Ed Sheeran Game of Thrones bullshit where, yeah, he could sing, but he didn't need to be there. I just truly and genuinely felt a raw and natural feeling from you, especially in the moments of survival and desperation. I mean, you were able to bring it. I mean, it was, I'm curious your methods. I mean, did you go method? I mean, did you study acting? I don't know your, background. I don't know what you've been doing, but like, just keep it up, man. Fuck. It was really good. You made the leads look even better because they were also very good at like expressing themselves, and you were kind of that. You were not just a pretty face to look at, is what I'm saying. And I feel like a lot of people thought that because, all the little girls like him and stuff like that. But that's definitely not the case. And so I really appreciate Christopher Nolan casting the right part. And for that, I commend it. I can really go even more in depth in this movie. I can talk about each and every scene that affected me, whether it was the U-boat scene or the oil slick scene or the cockpit scene with the submerging underwater, or, I mean, there's just so many intense moments throughout this film. But it really just all comes back to the main point of Christopher Nolan really nailing the horrors of war. And it's scary, and it's not a place I ever want to be, and these people did it. And I have to say, and it was a different time. That's how I want to end this. It was a different time. World War II was just, there was no internet, there was no TV. There were some scenes that were scary to me. Not just because of the horrors of war, but the scene in which they're on the boat, the father and the son looks at the airplane as it's getting shot down, the German fighter plane, and he's excited. Yeah, they got him, Dad. And it's just like, at the time, you genuinely were thinking you're killing the enemy, and it was a good thing. You weren't seeing the true grisly nature of war like you see today. I mean, you can go online and you can find people being mutilated and decapitated and blown up and all this shit, stuff you could never see during World War II. And so war has changed, and I respect that Christopher Nolan put that in this movie because that was the ideology back then. But you have to realize, and at least in my opinion, that the more you find out about war, the worse it feels like. The worse it is, the more you should avoid it. And, there's nothing more evident than watching a movie like this and saying, why? Why does this happen? Why? Germany almost took over the world in World War II. They were on the brink of capturing Britain, and if they would have gotten Europe, I don't even know. It would have been intense. I mean, I just can't imagine. I mean, we would have had to nuke Europe. It would have been fucking mind-blowing. And it was almost that there was a human being capable of doing that. And, we didn't find about the Holocaust until after World War II. There was things being hidden. And it was just a different time. It was just a different place. And as we progress forward, I feel like movies like this should stand as reminders to avoid it. And yes, I'm being a little bit of a liberal peace hippie guy right now, but it's really scary. I would never want to be drafted, and I would never go. I could say it right here on camera. Guilty as charged. If I ever get drafted, I'm not going anywhere. Throw me in jail. I will not go. Okay? Period. I don't believe in killing people, and I don't want to motherfucking die. So With that, guys, that'll do it for this episode. Hope you enjoyed it. Let me know in the comments if you agree, disagree, whatever that might be. Personally, I'd love to talk to you. I'd love to hear whether or not you think I'm wrong. I mean, maybe you think it was a great story. Maybe you think it was a great film because of that. Maybe there should never be this duality that I'm feeling right now. Or maybe you agree with me. Either way, let me know in the comments. Hit that subscribe button. Hit the bell. Stay tuned for the next one.